The clay weighs almost nothing in your hand. 4,000 years compacted into a fragment no larger than a credit card, surface covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed by a scribe whose name we'll never know. The tablet sits now in a climate-controlled vault beneath London, catalogued, photographed and largely ignored. But line 7 contains a phrase that appears nowhere else in the entire corpus of Mesopotamian literature, a phrase that, once translated, refuses to settle comfortably into any existing framework for understanding what the Sumerians believed about their gods. The phrase describes the Anunnaki turning weapons against each other, not against demons, not against chaos, against themselves. This matters because the Anunnaki weren't described in Sumerian texts as distant cosmic forces or abstract theological principles. They were administrators. They governed specific cities. They required food. They made decisions in councils. They had territorial boundaries, political disagreements and jurisdictions that occasionally overlapped in ways that created tension. And according to this fragment and others scattered across museum archives from Philadelphia to Baghdad, those tensions eventually escalated into open conflict. The fragment breaks off after 11 lines. The rest is missing, lost to erosion, or still buried somewhere in storage we haven't catalogued. But what those 11 lines describe, weapons that left land poisoned, cities where nothing grew for decades, destruction that didn't match the scale of anything Bronze Age warfare should have produced, suggests the conflict wasn't metaphorical. If you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, whether that's a bedroom in Oslo or a night shift in Singapore, or a long drive through empty highways outside Cleveland, you're part of something that spans more geography than the ancient world could have imagined. The questions these texts raise don't belong to any single place. They belong to anyone willing to sit with uncertainty long enough to see what patterns emerge. This investigation will move slowly, not because the material is simple, but because it isn't. These aren't texts that yield their meanings quickly, and the implications they carry deserve more than surface readings. By the time we're finished, you'll have seen evidence that can't be easily dismissed and questions that refuse easy answers. What you choose to do with that evidence is entirely your decision. The Sumerians didn't describe their civilization as something humans invented through trial and error. They described it as something that was taught. The cities appeared suddenly in the archaeological record, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, already possessing irrigation systems, administrative hierarchies, and architectural sophistication that typically requires generations to develop. Writing appeared essentially complete. Mathematical systems functioned at levels suggesting long observational foundations, and the texts, themselves once translated, insisted that this knowledge came from the Anunnaki, beings who descended and established order where none had existed. This claim sits uncomfortably in conventional chronology. Agricultural societies are supposed to develop gradually. Writing is supposed to evolve from simple tallies into complex script over centuries. Urban planning is supposed to emerge through incremental improvements as populations grow and needs become more sophisticated. But Sumerian cities don't show that progression. They appear already formed. The earliest temples at Eridu go down through multiple construction layers, each built directly atop the previous one, suggesting the site was recognized as sacred from the beginning. No exploratory phase, no experimental structures, just continuous rebuilding on the same spot for 3,000 years. The texts explain this by saying the Anunnaki chose Eridu. They established it as Enki's city, the first city, the place where divine rule began. Whether this represents historical memory of an actual founding event or theological explanation for a site whose origins had been forgotten, the fact remains. Sumerians understood their civilization as beginning with external intervention, not indigenous innovation. The word Anunnaki itself suggests this. The term translates approximately as princely offspring of An, or those who from heaven to earth came. The second translation appears more frequently in older compositions and carries spatial rather than genealogical meaning. These were beings who arrived. They came from elsewhere to establish themselves here. Early Sumerian texts list them by name and function. Enlil governed Nippur and controlled agricultural fertility and storms. Enki governed Eridu and managed freshwater sources beneath the earth. Nana governed and regulated lunar cycles. Inanna governed Uruk and controlled warfare and political power. Each major city had its patron Anunnaki, and each Anunnaki had defined responsibilities. This wasn't abstract theology. Temple archives document deliveries of offerings to specific deities with the same precision used for human officials. Monthly rations of grain, beer, and livestock specified by recipient. Storage records noting which chamber received which goods. Personnel lists tracking who served in whose household. If these were purely mythological beings, the administrative precision makes no sense. Why document deliveries to non-existent recipients? Why maintain personnel records for imaginary households? The simplest explanation is that someone was receiving these goods. Whether those recipients were actually divine beings called Anunnaki, or human representatives administering temple estates in their names, the system functioned as though the Anunnaki were present, active, and required material support. The relationship between Anunnaki and humans was framed as reciprocal but unequal. Humans provided labour and offerings. Anunnaki provided protection, knowledge, and governance. The arrangement was contractual rather than devotional. Temples weren't primarily places of worship. They were administrative centres managing the economic relationship between divine governors and human populations. This economic framing becomes important when we examine why conflicts emerged, because if the Anunnaki were real entities governing real territories with real resource requirements, then disputes over boundaries, resources, and authority weren't theological abstractions. They were political crises with material stakes. The Sumerian king list provides a chronological framework, though one that creates as many questions as it answers. The document lists rulers before the flood, 8 kings governing 5 cities, with reigns measured in tens of thousands of years, then the flood, then post-flood kings with shorter but still extraordinary reigns, gradually declining toward human ranges. Mainstream scholarship reads the astronomical pre-flood numbers as symbolic or corrupted data, but the king list itself treats them as straightforward chronology, listing them in the same administrative style used for grain counts and tax records. No mythological language. No indication the numbers represent anything other than what they state. If we accept that the king list preserves data its compilers believed accurate, even if we can't verify that accuracy, then it suggests something remarkable. The pre-flood period wasn't human history. Those weren't human rulers. They were Anunnaki rulers governing directly, which would explain lifespans no biological organism could achieve. After the flood, the pattern changes. Reigns become shorter. Political power shifts constantly between cities. Dynasties rise and fall. The stability of the pre-flood period gives way to chaos, suggesting that whatever governance structure existed before the flood didn't survive intact afterward. The flood itself marks the first major crisis documented in Sumerian texts, and significantly, it marks the first recorded conflict within the Anunnaki hierarchy. According to multiple sources, the Divine Council voted to destroy humanity. The decision was authorized at the highest levels, but one member defied that decision. Enki warned a human king named Ziusudra. He couldn't stop the flood. The authority had been granted and the mechanisms set in motion. But he could undermine it. He told Ziusudra to build a boat. Ziusudra survived. Humanity continued. This defiance created a permanent division. Enlil, who had advocated for human extinction, was forced to accept their survival. Enki, who had protected them, established a patronage relationship that would shape every subsequent interaction. The council that was supposed to function as unified authority had fractured, and that fracture would widen, because what the tablets describe in the centuries following the flood isn't divine harmony restored, it's escalating tension, territorial disputes, conflicts over authority symbols, gods abandoning cities, and eventually, around 2000 BCE, catastrophic destruction that ended Sumerian civilization entirely. The texts don't call it a war explicitly. They describe it as divine abandonment, as punishment, as storm and fire sent by angry gods. But they also describe weapons that don't match Bronze Age capabilities and destruction that lasted far longer than normal military campaigns produce. Whether these descriptions document actual events involving actual conflicts or represent how traumatized populations made sense of societal collapse, they follow a pattern: tension building over centuries, authority fracturing, factions forming, and finally, devastating violence that changed everything. The question we'll be tracing through the rest of this investigation is simple to state, but impossible to answer definitively. Were the Anunnaki real? Did their conflicts actually happen? And if so, what were they fighting over? The tablets hold pieces of the answer, but those pieces don't fit together easily, and the picture they form depends entirely on which framework you use to interpret them. The British Museum acquired most of its Mesopotamian collection during the mid-1800s, when archaeology was less a science than a treasure hunt conducted by men with shovels and uncertain maps. Austin Henry Layard excavated Nineveh beginning in 1849, pulling tens of thousands of clay tablets from collapsed library rooms where they'd sat undisturbed since the Assyrian Empire fell in 612 BCE. Most were catalogued hastily, photographed if they appeared significant, and filed into storage where they remained for decades. In 2009, a researcher working through previously photographed materials noticed something unusual in a cluster of fragments from the Kuyunjik collection. One small piece, perhaps 4 inches across, with 11 readable lines, contained a phrase that didn't match any known composition. The text was in Akkadian, dated to roughly the 7th century BCE, but describing events the scribe clearly considered much older. The phrase appeared in line 7, when the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki. Not war against demons, which appears frequently in Mesopotamian literature, not war against primordial chaos, which forms the foundation of creation narratives, war against themselves. The fragment continues with descriptions that don't fit comfortably into mythological interpretation. Weapons that burned without flame and left earth poisoned for 3 harvests. A city, possibly Shuruppak, where no birds sang for 40 years after fire fell from heaven. Then the tablet breaks off, the rest lost or still buried in unexamined storage somewhere in the museum's vast holdings. This isn't an isolated reference. When you examine Sumerian and Akkadian tablets across museums from Philadelphia to Paris to Baghdad, arranging them chronologically and geographically, a pattern emerges. References to conflicts between factions of gods, divine councils splintering, territories divided, weapons deployed, cities destroyed, and finally, around 2000 BCE, a series of lamentation texts describing catastrophic destruction that ended the Sumerian world. The standard scholarly interpretation treats these as separate mythological compositions serving different literary and religious purposes. The conflicts are read as allegories for natural disasters, seasonal changes, or political transitions between human dynasties, the destructions are explained as poetic responses to historical events, invasions, famines, systemic collapse, expressed through theological language about angry gods. This interpretation is reasonable. Ancient peoples often explained catastrophes through divine action. When cities fell, scribes wrote lamentations describing gods abandoning their temples. When droughts destroyed harvests, texts blamed divine anger. The mythological framework provided meaning for suffering that otherwise appeared random and senseless. But that framework starts to strain when you examine the specificity of what these texts describe. The weapons don't sound like Bronze Age technology. The durations of poisoned land don't match typical siege aftermath. The geographic patterns of destruction don't align with known military campaigns, and the consistency across independent sources separated by centuries and hundreds of miles suggests something more than coincidental mythological invention. The tablets describe a world where divine administrators governed territories, made decisions in councils, and competed for resources and authority using methods that range from political manoeuvring to open violence. If this represents purely mythological thinking, it's remarkably coherent mythology. If it represents distorted memory of actual events, then the events themselves must have been extraordinary enough to be remembered for millennia. The flood narrative provides the clearest example of this tension between mythological and historical interpretations. Every major culture in Mesopotamia preserved flood traditions. Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian all describe a catastrophic deluge that destroyed the world and killed most of humanity. The details vary between versions, but the core narrative remains stable across more than 2,000 years of textual transmission. Genesis preserves a version that entered biblical tradition, but the Mesopotamian accounts predate it by over 1,000 years. When George Smith translated the flood tablet from Nineveh in 1872, the discovery created immediate controversy precisely because it demonstrated that the biblical flood story had older Mesopotamian sources. The earliest written version appears in the Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian composition surviving in fragmentary form on a tablet catalogued as CBS 273 and housed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The surviving portion begins not with creation but with an already functioning world where cities exist. Humans work fields and kingship has been established. The narrative shifts when it describes the divine council making a decision. The tablet is damaged here, and crucial context is missing, but the sequence is clear enough. The gods discuss a problem, a solution is proposed, action is authorized. The fuller account preserved in the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, which dates to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE, specifies what that problem was. Humanity had multiplied across the earth. The noise of their activity, the constant grinding of grain, hammering of copper, voices of thousands conducting daily life, disturbed the gods. Enlil brought the matter before the divine council, stating explicitly that he was losing sleep over the racket. The solution escalated over several attempts. First plague, then drought, then famine. Each time humanity recovered. Finally, Enlil proposed the ultimate solution, a flood that would erase everything. What makes this narrative historically interesting isn't the flood itself. Catastrophic floods are natural events that occur regularly in river valleys, but the division it created within the Anunnaki hierarchy. The council voted to proceed. The decision was formalized, but Enki defied it. He couldn't stop the flood. The authority for that action had been granted at the highest levels, but he could undermine it. The Eridu Genesis describes how Enki approached a reed wall, not a person, but a wall, and spoke within earshot of Ziusudra, a king of Shuruppak, and a priest devoted to Enki. The instruction was procedural: tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, save life. The text even specifies engineering requirements. The boat's dimensions should be equal, its length and width the same. This represents a fracture at the highest level of divine authority. The council made a unanimous decision, and one of its most powerful members directly violated it. The implications ripple forward through every text that follows, because if the Anunnaki Council could fracture over humanity's fate, what prevented further divisions over other matters? The answer, according to the texts, is nothing prevented them. The conflicts escalated. Understanding why requires understanding what the flood decision was actually about. The Atrahasis epic provides context that standard biblical retellings omit. Humanity wasn't created as the pinnacle of divine craftsmanship or the purpose of creation. They were created to solve a labour problem. The text describes a period when younger gods called the Igigi were assigned to dig irrigation canals and maintain cities. They laboured under these conditions for what the text states was 40 years. Then they revolted, burning their tools and surrounding Enlil's house in what the text describes as a siege. The crisis could have escalated into divine civil war. Instead, the council reached a solution: create a new class of workers, mix clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god, specifically Ilu, identified as the instigator of the Igigi revolt, and fashion a hybrid creature capable of labour but lacking divine power. Enki designed them. The goddess Nintu assisted in their creation. The process is described with language that translates uncomfortably: mixing, shaping, biological procedures that the texts don't have precise technical vocabulary to express more clearly. But the function is explicit. Humans were created to take over the work the Igigi refused to continue. So when the council voted to destroy humanity because they'd become too numerous and noisy, they were voting to destroy Enki's solution to a crisis that had nearly torn apart the divine hierarchy. From Enki's perspective, this was madness. If humanity was eliminated, who would do the work? Would the Igigi return to canal digging? Wouldn't that risk reigniting the rebellion that created the crisis in the first place? The texts don't provide Enki's internal reasoning. Ancient Mesopotamian literature rarely dwells on psychological motivation, but the pattern speaks clearly. Enki acted to preserve humanity. Enlil acted to destroy them, and the conflict between these positions wasn't theological. It was political and economic. The flood came. When it receded, Ziusudra's boat came to rest on a mountain. He emerged, offered sacrifice, and according to the Atrahasis epic, Enlil arrived to inspect the cleaned earth and discovered survivors. The text records his rage. All people were supposed to perish. How did any man survive? Enki's defiance was now exposed. What followed wasn't divine harmony restored, but a tense negotiation. Enki argued that destroying all humanity was excessive. He advocated for more limited population controls. Natural predation, disease, barrenness in some women. Enlil reluctantly accepted these terms, but the fundamental breach remained. The highest divine council had made a unanimous decision, and one of its most powerful members had directly sabotaged it. Authority had been challenged. Precedent had been set, and in the texts that follow, describing the centuries after the flood, that precedent would be invoked repeatedly as different Anunnaki challenged different aspects of the established order. The symbol of that order, mentioned across multiple compositions, was an object called the Tablet of Destinies. Its possession conferred supreme authority. Its theft represented ultimate rebellion. And according to the texts, it was stolen more than once, each theft marking an escalation in the struggle for control that the flood decision had exposed but not resolved. The pattern was established. Authority could be defied, decisions could be undermined, and conflicts that should have remained in council chambers could spill into something far more destructive. The texts suggest the Anunnaki learned this slowly through escalating crises that eventually forced them to confront a question they'd been avoiding since the Igigi revolt. What happens when those who govern cannot agree on how to govern, and when the mechanisms meant to resolve disputes become objects of dispute themselves? The Tablet of Destinies appears in Mesopotamian texts as both physical object and constitutional authority. The Sumerian term is Dup-Nam Tara, the Akkadian Tupi Shemati, both translating roughly as Tablet of Fates or Tablet of Decrees. In a culture where written documents sealed with cylinder seals carried legal force, where property transfers required clay contracts and royal edicts were inscribed and archived, this tablet functioned as the master document from which all other authority derived. Whoever possessed it held supreme executive power. Their commands became cosmic law. The tablet didn't grant magical ability, it granted legitimacy, the right to decree what happens next. Enlil possessed it, initially because he'd been granted supreme authority by Anu after the division of the cosmos. Enki governed the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm. Enlil governed everything else: air, storms, agriculture, the surface world. The Tablet of Destinies confirmed this arrangement in a form that was legally binding and theoretically permanent. Theoretically, the Anzu epic, preserved in multiple versions spanning Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian recensions across more than 1,000 years, describes what happened when that permanence was challenged. A creature named Anzu served as doorkeeper to Enlil's throne room. The text describes Anzu as massive, sometimes depicted as an eagle with a lion's head, sometimes as a storm demon with wings capable of generating hurricane winds. Anzu watched Enlil bathe. He observed where the Tablet of Destinies was kept, and he formulated a plan: seize the tablet while Enlil was vulnerable. The theft succeeded. Anzu took the tablet and fled to a mountain stronghold. With possession of the tablet, he now held supreme authority. Enlil's commands no longer functioned. The cosmos ground to a halt. The text describes this in administrative language. The rites were interrupted. Silence reigned. The gods panicked. They needed a champion to fight Anzu and recover the tablet. But there was a problem that made the mission nearly impossible. Anzu now possessed the authority to nullify any attack. He could decree that arrows don't fly, that weapons don't cut, that his enemies are defeated before they strike. Several gods refused the mission. Finally, Ninurta, Enlil's son, the warrior god associated with both agricultural bounty and military conquest, accepted the task. The battle itself is described with considerable detail. Ninurta attacked with bow and arrows. Anzu used the tablet's authority to neutralize them mid-flight. The arrows stopped in the air. Ninurta's weapons became useless. How do you fight someone who can nullify your attacks by decree? The solution came from Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, who advised a specific strategy. Ninurta must shoot not at Anzu directly, but at his wings. The text suggests that severing Anzu's pinions would break his grip on the tablet. Whether this worked through physical mechanics or symbolic logic, cutting his wings disrupts his authority, isn't entirely clear, but Ninurta followed the advice. His arrows struck true. Anzu's wings were severed. The tablet fell. Ninurta recovered it and returned it to Enlil. Order was restored. Ninurta was rewarded. The cosmos resumed its proper function. Crisis averted. Except the crisis wasn't truly averted. It was merely postponed, because the theft of the Tablet of Destinies happens more than once in Mesopotamian literature. Different thieves, different circumstances, but the same fundamental pattern. Someone seizes the symbol of supreme authority. Chaos erupts. A champion fights to recover it, and order is temporarily restored. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserved on 7 tablets dating to around the 12th century BCE, the tablet plays a central role in divine succession. Initially, Anu possessed it. After Ea killed Apsu, the primordial freshwater deity, whose mingling with Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, produced the first generation of gods, authority shifted. Tiamat, seeking revenge for Apsu's death, created an army and elevated Kingu to lead it. She gave Kingu the Tablet of Destinies, effectively making him king. Kingu wore it on his chest as a symbol of his authority. When Marduk defeated Tiamat and her forces, one of his first acts was to take the tablet from Kingu. The text is explicit. From Kingu, who had become chief among them, he took the Tablet of Destinies, not his by right. Marduk then presented the tablet to Anu, who confirmed Marduk's new status as king of the gods. Authority had transferred again. The era epic, a later composition, dating to around the 8th century BCE, describes yet another crisis of authority. This time, Marduk himself abandoned Babylon, either voluntarily or through deception, depending on how you read the damaged text. Error, the god of plague and warfare, convinced Marduk to leave his throne temporarily. With Marduk absent, Error seized power and unleashed catastrophe on Mesopotamia. The text describes Error destroying cities, slaughtering populations, and deliberately sowing chaos. His actions weren't random violence. They were strategic. He was demonstrating that with Marduk gone, he could do as he pleased. When Marduk returned and restored order, the damage had already been done. What's striking across all these narratives is that the Tablet of Destinies never stays secure. It can be stolen, given away, lost, or taken by force. And each time it changes hands, the cosmos destabilizes. From a mythological perspective, you might read these stories as allegories for natural disasters or seasonal cycles. From an anthropological perspective, they might represent Bronze Age political instability, rulers constantly overthrown, dynasties rising and falling. But if we take the Sumerian framework seriously, if we consider that these texts might preserve historical memory of actual events involving actual entities, then the tablet represents something more concrete, perhaps a physical charter, a sealed document granting executive authority over territories and populations, a master control system whose possession determined who could issue binding commands. If that's the case, then the repeated thefts weren't cosmic allegories but political coups. Each theft would represent a challenge to the existing power structure. Anzu's theft challenged Enlil directly, a subordinate seizing authority from his superior. Kingu, receiving the tablet from Tiamat, represented an older order attempting to reclaim power from younger gods who'd killed Apsu. Error's takeover during Marduk's absence represented opportunistic usurpation during a power vacuum. None of these conflicts were resolved permanently. Authority was recovered, but the possibility of future theft remained. The system was inherently unstable because power rested on possession of a physical object that could be taken. And while these thefts occurred at the highest levels of divine hierarchy, struggles between major gods over cosmic kingship, other texts describe conflicts at different scales, territorial disputes between cities and their patron deities, conflicts between surface-dwelling and underworld Anunnaki, tensions between those gods who favoured humanity's survival and those who sought its destruction or control. One such conflict is preserved in perhaps the most psychologically complex Mesopotamian narrative we possess, Inanna's descent to the underworld. On the surface, it reads as a myth about death and rebirth, but examined within the framework of Anunnaki factional conflict, it becomes something else. A record of open warfare between two branches of the divine family over jurisdiction, respect, and the question of whether underworld authority could challenge the power of Heaven's Queen. The text opens with a statement of intention that explains nothing. From the great above, she opened her ear to the great below. Inanna, queen of heaven and goddess of Uruk, decides to descend into the underworld. The text doesn't say why. She simply announces she's going and tells her servant Ninshubur to alert the other gods if she doesn't return within 3 days. She dresses herself in the regalia of her power: crown, lapis necklace, royal robe, breastplate, measuring rod and line. Each piece is listed specifically, catalogued with the precision you'd use for inventory documentation. Then she approaches the gates of the underworld, which is governed by her older sister, Ereshkigal. The relationship between them is hostile. When Inanna arrives at the outer gate, the gatekeeper Neti informs Ereshkigal of her sister's presence. Ereshkigal's reaction isn't welcoming curiosity. The text describes her striking her thigh in anger. Nevertheless, Ereshkigal instructs Neti to admit Inanna, but to enforce the laws of the underworld. These laws are specific and procedural. The underworld has 7 gates. At each gate, Inanna must remove one piece of her divine regalia. By the time she reaches Ereshkigal's throne, she is naked and powerless. The stripping isn't symbolic. Each item Inanna removes represents a specific aspect of her authority. The crown signifies rulership. The lapis necklace represents divine status. The measuring rod and line are tools of judgment. By the 7th gate, she's been reduced from Queen of Heaven to a vulnerable supplicant with no protection and no power. When Inanna finally stands before Ereshkigal, the text becomes chilling. The Anunnaki judges of the underworld fix the eye of death upon her. Inanna dies. Her corpse is hung on a hook like a piece of meat. This isn't metaphorical death. The text treats it as physical, final, and humiliating. Inanna, one of the most powerful Anunnaki, has been killed by another Anunnaki in her own realm, and Ereshkigal has no intention of releasing her. 3 days pass. Ninshubur, following Inanna's instructions, goes to the other gods for help. She approaches Enlil first. He refuses, saying Inanna got what she deserved for trespassing. She goes to Nanna, the moon god. He also refuses. Finally, she goes to Enki. Enki agrees to help. He creates 2 beings from the dirt under his fingernails, small sexless creatures called the Kugara and Galatur. He gives them the food and water of life, and sends them to the underworld with instructions: flatter Ereshkigal, gain her trust, and when she offers a reward, ask for Inanna's corpse. The plan works. The creatures descend, offer Ereshkigal sympathy during what the text describes as labour pains, and are rewarded with Inanna's body. They revive her with the food and water of life. But there's a catch. Underworld law requires a replacement. Someone must take Inanna's place. Demons escort her back to the surface, with instructions to seize whoever she designates as her substitute. Inanna returns to Uruk and finds her husband, Dumuzi, sitting on her throne wearing fine clothes, showing no signs of mourning her absence. The text describes her reaction with cold fury. She fixes the eye of death upon him, the same judgment the underworld Anunnaki had fixed upon her, and designates him as her replacement. Dumuzi flees. The demons pursue him. After a chase involving multiple divine interventions and temporary reprieves, Dumuzi is caught and dragged to the underworld. The text ends with a compromise. Dumuzi will spend half the year in the underworld. His sister Geshti Nana will spend the other half alternating eternally. Scholars typically read this narrative as a seasonal myth explaining agricultural cycles. Dumuzi represents vegetation that dies in summer heat and returns with winter rains. The descent and return structure mirrors natural patterns of death and rebirth. But that reading doesn't explain the conflict's intensity. Why does Ereshkigal kill Inanna? Why do Enlil and Nanna refuse to help? Why does Enki intervene when other senior gods won't? Why does the text frame Inanna's journey not as cosmic necessity, but as deliberate intrusion into territory she has no right to enter? The answers become clearer when you recognise that this isn't mythology about seasons. It's documentation of a jurisdictional crisis between two Anunnaki administrators governing separate realms. Inanna rules heaven and earth. Ereshkigal rules the underworld. These are not complementary territories, but competing claims to authority over the same populations. When humans die, whose jurisdiction do they enter? If Inanna governs all of Earth's surface, does that include the dead who are buried beneath it? Or does Ereshkigal's underworld authority supersede surface claims? The text doesn't state this conflict explicitly, but the structural details suggest it. Inanna descends without permission, wearing full royal regalia, a statement of authority. Ereshkigal responds by stripping that authority piece by piece and then executing Inanna for the transgression. This is enforcement of territorial boundaries through lethal means. Enlil and Nanna's refusal to help makes sense in this context. They're staying out of a jurisdictional dispute between two powerful Anunnaki where neither party is clearly in the right. Inanna violated underworld protocols. Ereshkigal responded with excessive force. Intervening would mean taking sides in a conflict that could expand if mishandled. Enki's willingness to intervene is consistent with his established pattern. He defied the council during the flood decision. He acts according to his own judgment, regardless of official decrees. His intervention here isn't about supporting Inanna specifically. It's about preventing one Anunnaki from permanently killing another, which would set a catastrophic precedent. Because if Ereshkigal can kill Inanna and face no consequences, what prevents other territorial disputes from escalating to lethal force? The compromise that ends the narrative, Dumuzi alternating with Gesht Inanna in the underworld, reads less like seasonal allegory and more like a negotiated settlement to prevent further conflict. Ereshkigal gets a substitute satisfying underworld law. Inanna doesn't lose her husband permanently, preserving her status. The system remains unstable, requiring continuous replacement. But open war is avoided, for now. The pattern that emerges across these narratives, the flood defiance, the tablet thefts, Inanna's descent, is escalation. Each crisis exposes fractures in the authority structure. Each resolution is temporary. Each conflict establishes precedent for the next one. The texts describe a system under increasing strain, and that strain becomes explicit in compositions describing conflicts that don't resolve through negotiation or individual heroism. Conflicts that require choosing sides. Conflicts where neutrality isn't possible and where the outcome determines which faction controls which territories. The clearest example appears in a cycle of narratives about Lagash and Umma, two Sumerian city-states separated by approximately 25 miles. Their border dispute lasted for generations and is documented in inscriptions, royal chronicles, and dedicatory texts spanning nearly 2 centuries. But this wasn't merely a human political conflict. The texts consistently frame it as a dispute between the city's patron gods, Ningirsu of Lagash and Shara of Umma. The earliest reference appears on the Stele of the Vultures, a limestone monument erected by Eannatum, king of Lagash, around 2450 BCE. The stele depicts battle scenes on one side and divine intervention on the other. The inscription describes how Ningirsu himself fought for Lagash, casting a great net over the armies of Umma and personally slaughtering their soldiers. Whether this represents literal divine intervention or rhetorical flourish justifying Lagash's military victory, the text treats Ningirsu's involvement as factual. It specifies that he measured the contested boundary, fixed border stones, and decreed that the land belonged to Lagash by divine right. Umma didn't accept this. Successive rulers of Umma repeatedly violated the boundary, destroyed the border stones, and seized the disputed territory. Lagash repeatedly counterattacked, drove them back, and re-established the boundary markers. The cycle continued for generations. The text described this conflict using language that exceeds normal territorial disputes. When Umma's ruler Urlama destroyed the boundary stones, the inscription states he devoured the field of Ningirsu and committed an offence against the god himself, not merely against Lagash's human population. The implication is that these weren't just fields. They were divine property assigned to specific Anunnaki, and violating those boundaries constituted theft from the gods. If the Anunnaki were actual administrators governing territories, this conflict makes perfect sense. Two cities with overlapping border claims, each backed by their patron deity, neither willing to concede. The dispute becomes irresolvable because it's not just about land, it's about which Anunnaki's authority takes precedence when jurisdictions overlap. The conflict eventually required external mediation. An inscription from Enmetena, another king of Lagash, describes how Enlil himself intervened to settle the dispute. He measured the boundary, assigned the contested territory to Ningirsu, and decreed that Umma must pay tribute for any use of the land. But even divine decree didn't end the conflict permanently. Umma continued violating the boundary. Lagash continued enforcing it. The cycle persisted until both city-states were eventually absorbed into larger political entities that rendered the original dispute moot. What's significant isn't who won. Neither city achieved permanent victory. But what the conflict reveals about Anunnaki governance. The system depended on clear territorial boundaries and recognized authority hierarchies. When boundaries were unclear, or when patron deities backed competing claims, the system had no peaceful resolution mechanism except appeals to higher authority. And when higher authority was itself divided, when Enlil and Enki disagreed, when the council couldn't reach consensus, the conflicts escalated beyond anything boundary disputes or tablet thefts represented. They escalated towards something the texts describe in language that doesn't fit Bronze Age capabilities, weapons that burned without flame, cities poisoned for generations, destruction that required divine intervention to stop because human agency alone couldn't contain it. The texts don't call it war explicitly. They describe it as divine abandonment, as punishment sent by angry gods, as storms and fire that destroyed cities. But they also describe factions, describe choosing sides, describe conflicts where neutrality wasn't possible, and they describe, in careful detail, what happened when those conflicts reached their conclusion around 2000 BCE, in a series of catastrophes that ended Sumerian civilization entirely. The lamentation texts that document this destruction are unlike anything else in Mesopotamian literature. They don't celebrate victory or justify divine anger. They mourn. They catalogue what was lost with specificity that suggests eyewitness testimony. Which gates fell first? Which neighbourhoods burned? Where refugees fled and found no safety? Whether these texts describe natural disasters, military invasions, or something the scribes themselves couldn't fully explain, they document the end of a world, and they document it using language that keeps pointing toward a conclusion the texts themselves seem reluctant to state directly, that the Anunnaki's conflicts with each other finally exceeded the system's capacity to contain them. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur survives on at least 22 clay tablets and fragments scattered across museums in Philadelphia, Istanbul, Baghdad and Oxford. The composition dates to approximately 2000 BCE, written shortly after the catastrophic fall of Ur, the last major capital of the Sumerian Empire. The text begins not with explanation, but with abandonment. Nana, the moon god who governed Ur for generations, has left his city. The text describes this departure with bureaucratic precision. He vacated his temple, removed his protection, and withdrew to an unspecified location outside the city's boundaries. The other gods follow. Ningal, Nana's wife, departs. Enki abandons Eridu. Inanna leaves Uruk. City after city, the patron deities who had governed them for millennia simply leave. The text doesn't explain why. It only documents the sequence. First divine departure, then human catastrophe. What follows is destruction on a scale that the text struggles to describe. The lamentation catalogues it methodically, moving through Ur's districts with architectural specificity. The palace is burned. The treasury is looted. The Ekishnagal temple, Nana's primary sanctuary, is demolished. The text specifies which gates fell, which walls were breached, where fires spread from one quarter to another. But the destruction doesn't sound like normal military siege. The text describes storms, but storms that behave wrong. They don't bring rain. They bring something the text calls evil wind that poisons everything it touches. People who encounter this wind die. Animals die. Plants wither. The land itself becomes toxic. The Kiyum lamentation states, "The storm ordered by Enlil in hate, the storm which wears away the land, covered Ur like a cloth, veiled it like a linen sheet." This storm lasted an unspecified duration, but long enough to reduce a thriving capital to ruins where nothing could survive. Mainstream scholarship interprets this as poetic description of military conquest, likely by the Elamites, who invaded from the east around 2004 BCE. The evil wind represents the psychological trauma of invasion. The divine abandonment represents theological explanation for why Ur fell. The gods must have withdrawn their protection, otherwise the city couldn't have been defeated. But that interpretation requires ignoring how different this destruction is from other siege accounts in Mesopotamian literature. When texts describe normal warfare, they catalogue armies, weapons, tactics, casualties. The lamentation over Ur does something else. It describes environmental catastrophe that persists after the fighting ends. The text states that after the storm passed, the city remained uninhabitable. The fields produced nothing. The canals filled with corpses. Survivors fled and could find no refuge because surrounding regions were equally devastated. This doesn't match a targeted military campaign. It matches something that poisoned an entire region. The lamentation over Sumer and Ur, a related composition, expands the geographic scope. It describes similar destruction spreading across multiple city-states: Eridu, Ur, Nippur, Uruk, Larsa, Isin. The entire southern Mesopotamian plain, the heartland of Sumerian civilization, is described as wasted. The text attributes this to a decision made by Enlil and An in the Divine Council. They decreed that Sumer would be destroyed. The storm was sent to execute that decree. And critically, the text describes other gods opposing this decision. Ningal pleads with Nana to intercede on Ur's behalf. Nana appeals to An and Enlil in council, arguing that destroying Ur is excessive and unjust. His appeal is rejected. The decree stands. Nana is ordered to abandon his city. He complies, but the text describes him weeping as he departs. This is the flood decision repeating. A divine council authorises destruction. At least one god objects, but is overruled. The decree is executed regardless of objections, except this time there's no Enki to sabotage it. No human survives to rebuild. The destruction is total, and the civilization doesn't recover in its original form. What caused the council to decree Sumer's destruction? The texts don't provide clear explanation. The lamentation over mentions human sin, specifically violations of divine laws and failure to maintain proper temple service. But this reads like theological necessity rather than sufficient cause. Sumerian cities had experienced lapses in temple service before without facing annihilation. The Curse of Agade, another lamentation text describing the earlier fall, of Akkad around 2200 BCE, provides more specific causation. The text describes how Naram Sin, king of Akkad, offended Enlil by damaging the Ekur temple in Nippur during a military campaign. Enlil's response was to send the Gutians, mountain tribes from the north, to invade and destroy Akkad. But the destruction described exceeds normal invasion. The text states that after Agade fell, the land became cursed. Agriculture failed across the entire region. Trade ceased. The cities that had served Agade collapsed economically. The devastation persisted for generations, suggesting systemic rather than localized damage. The pattern across these lamentation texts is consistent. Divine council makes a decision. Destruction is decreed. Execution follows using methods that don't match normal Bronze Age warfare, and the aftermath includes environmental damage that persists far longer than military campaigns produce. If these texts describe mythology, they're remarkably consistent. Mythology across independent compositions, separated by decades or centuries. If they describe actual events, the events themselves must have involved destructive capabilities that exceeded what human armies of that period could achieve. The fragmented tablet discovered in 2009 adds a crucial detail to this pattern. The phrase, "when the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki," suggests the destructions weren't punishments sent by unified divine will against human targets. They were conflicts between factions of Anunnaki themselves, with human cities caught in the crossfire. This reframes everything. The divine abandonment described in the Lamentations isn't gods withdrawing in disgust at human sin. It's gods evacuating their cities before those cities are destroyed in conflicts between competing Anunnaki factions. Nana leaving before the storm arrives makes sense if he knew the storm was coming and couldn't prevent it. Ningal pleading with Nana to save the city makes sense if she understood the destruction wasn't divine punishment, but factional warfare, where happened to be on the losing side. Enlil decreeing Sumer's destruction makes sense if Enlil's faction had decided to eliminate rival Anunnaki strongholds and the cities governed by them. The council division makes sense if different Anunnaki held different positions on whether this level of destruction was necessary or justified, and the weapons that burned without flame, the evil wind that poisoned land for generations, the storms that behaved wrong. These make sense if they weren't poetic descriptions of normal warfare, but attempts to describe weapons the scribes had no technical vocabulary to explain more precisely. The texts preserve what they could. They documented divine councils, factional divisions, cities abandoned by their patron deities, and destruction using methods that exceeded Bronze Age norms. They recorded it with the specificity you'd expect from administrative scribes trained to document what they observed, even when what they observed resisted easy explanation. whether those observations describe actual events or represent how traumatized populations made sense of systemic collapse through theological frameworks remains debatable. But the consistency across independent texts, the specificity of the details, and the pattern of escalation from early conflicts over authority to final catastrophic destruction, all of this suggests the texts are trying to preserve coherent historical memory, not create disconnected mythological allegories. And if that's the case, if these texts do preserve historical memory, then the final war they describe wasn't between gods and humans. It was between Anunnaki factions whose conflicts over governance, territory and authority finally exceeded every mechanism designed to contain them and spilled into violence that destroyed the civilization they'd established. The question becomes, what were they fighting over in that final conflict? What could justify destroying cities that had functioned for millennia? What stakes were high enough to warrant weapons that poisoned land and killed populations? The texts point towards an answer, though they never state it directly. The conflicts weren't about territory alone, or resources alone, or authority alone. They were about all three simultaneously, compounded by centuries of unresolved tensions dating back to the Agigi Revolt, the Flood Decision, and every factional crisis that followed. The system had been unstable from the beginning. It survived as long as compromise was possible, as long as competing Anunnaki could negotiate settlements and accept temporary resolutions. But eventually, the accumulated weight of unresolved disputes, competing territorial claims, and fundamental disagreements about governance made compromise impossible. And when compromise failed, what remained was conflict resolved through force rather than negotiation. The text described this not as divine mystery, but as political inevitability, the predictable outcome of a governance structure that concentrated power without providing legitimate mechanisms for resolving disputes when those who held power disagreed. The archaeological evidence for what happened around 2000 BCE doesn't match the textual accounts perfectly, but it doesn't contradict them either. Excavations at Ur, Uruk, Nippur, and other major Sumerian sites reveal destruction layers dating to this period. Buildings burned, walls collapsed, occupation ceased abruptly at sites that had been continuously inhabited for millennia, but the physical evidence shows typical siege destruction, fire damage, scattered artifacts, structural collapse consistent with military assault. There's no archaeological signature for mysterious weapons or poisoned land. The cities were destroyed, but they were destroyed in ways that Bronze Age armies could achieve with conventional means. This creates interpretive tension. Either the texts exaggerate normal warfare through theological language, describing mundane destruction as divine catastrophe, or the weapons they describe didn't leave physical traces that survive archaeologically. A third possibility exists. The texts preserve accurate memory of events whose physical evidence eroded, was buried too deeply to detect, or appears in forms we don't recognise as conflict-related. Soil samples from agricultural regions surrounding Ur show elevated salinity levels beginning around 2000 BCE. Salinity itself isn't mysterious. Irrigation without proper drainage causes salt accumulation that eventually renders fields infertile. But the speed and extent of salinisation during this period exceeds normal accumulation rates. The fields didn't gradually decline over generations. They collapsed within decades, suggesting massive irrigation system failure across the entire southern Mesopotamian plain simultaneously. Whether this resulted from neglect during warfare, deliberate destruction of canals, or environmental factors, the texts describe as evil wind. The outcome matches what the Lamentations describe: land that stopped producing, forcing populations to abandon regions that had supported cities for thousands of years. Population data reconstructed from settlement surveys shows dramatic decline across southern Mesopotamia between 2100 and 1900 BCE. Major urban centres shrank or were abandoned entirely. Smaller settlements disappeared. The population density that had characterised Sumerian civilization for over a millennium simply vanished. People didn't vanish. They migrated north toward Babylon and Assyria, or dispersed into smaller agricultural communities, or died during the conflicts and famines the Lamentations describe. But the urban culture that defined Sumerian civilization ended. The language continued in scribal schools and religious contexts for another 1,000 years, but as a scholarly language rather than living speech. Sumerian, as a spoken language, was replaced by Akkadian. Political power shifted from southern city-states to Babylonian dynasties centred farther north. The cultural continuity that had persisted since the early dynastic period broke. When civilization rebuilt, it rebuilt differently, governed by different peoples, speaking different languages, worshipping the same gods but with different names and different theological frameworks. This represents civilizational discontinuity of a scale that occurs rarely in human history. Egypt experienced it after the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, but recovered many core cultural elements. The Maya experienced it after their classical collapse around 900 CE. The Indus Valley civilization experienced it around 1900 BCE and never fully recovered at all. Sumer experienced it around 2000 BCE, and unlike gradual decline or conquest that preserves elements of the defeated culture, this was rupture. The texts describe it as such, not decline but destruction, not transformation but ending. What could cause discontinuity of this magnitude? Conventional explanations point to environmental factors, accumulated salinization making agriculture unsustainable, climate shifts reducing rainfall, irrigation system collapse due to silt accumulation in canals. These are all valid factors that contributed to Sumer's decline. Political explanations add Elamite invasions from the east, Amorite migrations from the west, and internal conflicts between city-states that weakened them against external threats. These also contributed, but these explanations, while accurate, don't fully account for the text's insistence that something different happened, that this wasn't normal civilizational decline but catastrophic destruction executed deliberately by divine powers in conflict with each other. If the Anunnaki were real entities governing these cities, then their conflicts would produce exactly this pattern: sudden, divine abandonment followed by destruction using capabilities exceeding human norms, followed by environmental collapse that made recovery impossible, followed by population dispersal and cultural discontinuity. The texts describe factional warfare between Anunnaki, who supported different cities, different governance approaches, different visions for how their relationship with humanity should function. They describe Enlil's faction as authoritarian, viewing humans as labour resources requiring strict control. They describe Enki's faction as more permissive, viewing humans as creations requiring protection and guidance. These aren't just theological differences, they're fundamental disagreements about governance that had been present since the flood decision and had never been resolved. When Enlil decreed the flood, Enki defied him. When the council voted to destroy gods associated with Enki's faction objected but were overruled. The pattern suggests persistent factional division where one faction, Enlil's, held authoritative power to issue decrees, while another faction, Enki's, held sufficient power to sometimes resist but not to prevent. Eventually, resistance escalates to open conflict. Enki's faction can't prevent Enlil's decrees through council procedures, so they resist through other means. Enlil's faction responds by eliminating rival strongholds. the conflict spreads. Neutral parties are forced to choose sides, and what began as political disagreement becomes war. The fragmentary tablet stating, "When the Anunnaki made war upon the Anunnaki," fits this pattern. It suggests internal conflict, faction against faction, rather than unified divine action against human targets. The weapons it describes, burning without flame, poisoning land for years, don't match Bronze Age capabilities, but do match what advanced technology might produce, if described by observers lacking technical vocabulary to explain it precisely. If the Anunnaki possessed capabilities for climate manipulation, energy weapons, or biological contamination, scribes witnessing their use would describe them in whatever language they had available. Fire from heaven for aerial bombardment, evil wind for chemical or biological agents, storms that don't bring rain for weapon effects that resembled storms but function differently. This interpretation requires accepting that Bronze Age populations encountered technology so far beyond their capabilities that they could only describe it through theological frameworks. That's speculative, but it's not impossible. And it's precisely what the texts suggest when you read them, not as mythology, but as eyewitness accounts filtered through scribal tradition and transmitted across centuries. The alternative, that ancient scribes invented remarkably consistent details about factional divine warfare, specific weapons with unusual properties, and environmental damage persisting for generations, all as poetic embellishment of normal military history, requires accepting that mythology accidentally created patterns that look like distorted technological descriptions. That's also speculative, and possibly less parsimonious than accepting the texts might preserve, however imperfectly, memory of actual events involving actual conflicts. The final stage of the war, according to the texts, wasn't fought primarily in Sumer. By the time Ur fell, the conflict had already moved elsewhere. The destructions in Sumer were final actions, eliminating cities that could serve as rival bases rather than primary battlegrounds. Where the primary conflict occurred, the texts don't specify clearly. References appear to northern regions, to mountains, to locations outside the Mesopotamian plain. The geographic vagueness might reflect that scribes writing in southern cities didn't have direct knowledge of events occurring elsewhere, or it might reflect deliberate obscurity, information deemed too dangerous to record explicitly. What the texts do specify is outcome. The war ended not with one faction defeating the other, but with mutual withdrawal. The Anunnaki, both factions, abandoned direct governance of human cities. They departed, leaving behind temple complexes, administrative structures, and populations who suddenly had to manage systems they'd been taught to operate but not to design. This abandonment is described across multiple late Sumerian and early Babylonian texts. The gods don't die, they don't lose power, they simply leave, retreating to locations the texts identify vaguely as distant mountains or the horizon of heaven. Why would victors in a conflict abandon what they'd fought to control? The texts suggest an answer, though indirectly. The cost of continuing the conflict exceeded the value of what they were fighting over. The destructions had damaged infrastructure beyond easy repair. The human populations had been decimated. The cities that remained required resources to rebuild that neither faction could afford while maintaining military opposition to the other. Withdrawal wasn't surrender. It was strategic disengagement, a recognition that continuing the conflict would destroy what remained of their accomplishments in Mesopotamia. But withdrawal didn't mean permanent departure. The text described the Anunnaki as present but distant, involved but indirectly, governing through intermediaries rather than direct rule. And they describe something else, something the Lamentations mention but don't elaborate, the possibility of return. The transition texts, compositions written during the early Old Babylonian period after Sumer's collapse, describe a world in flux. The gods are still present in theological terms, still worshipped, still addressed in prayers and hymns, but the relationship has changed. They no longer walk among humans. They no longer govern cities directly. They communicate through dreams, omens, and prophetic intermediaries rather than through face-to-face council meetings with kings. This shift appears so fundamental that later Mesopotamian cultures developed an entire professional class dedicated to interpreting divine will through indirect signs, haruspicy, reading animal organs, extispicy, interpreting bird flight patterns, oniromancy, decoding dreams. These practices existed in Sumerian culture, but as supplementary methods. In Babylonian and Assyrian periods, they became primary mechanisms for accessing divine guidance. The implication is clear. Direct access had ended. What had once been routine, kings receiving instructions from patron deities in temple sanctuaries, became rare or ceased entirely. The administrative relationship that defined early dynastic and Ur-the-Third periods gave way to something more distant and mediated. Why this withdrawal occurred is never explained directly in the texts. They document the change without analysing its causes, but the timing suggests connection to the conflicts that destroyed Ur and ended Sumerian political dominance. If the Anunnaki had fought each other to near exhaustion, if their weapons had poisoned territories and decimated populations, if the infrastructure they'd built had been damaged beyond easy repair, then withdrawal makes strategic sense. Continue direct governance and risk reigniting conflicts that had already proven catastrophically destructive, or withdraw to defensible positions and manage human affairs indirectly through proxies and intermediaries. The texts suggest they chose withdrawal, but they also suggest that withdrawal was never intended as permanent abandonment. References appear in late Babylonian and Assyrian compositions to future returns, to ages when the gods will resume direct rule, to cyclical patterns where divine presence and absence alternate according to cosmic schedules. These references are fragmentary and often embedded in prophetic or apocalyptic literature, which makes them difficult to interpret with certainty. But the pattern is recognizable. The gods departed but left mechanisms for eventual return. What those mechanisms might be, the texts don't specify clearly, but they do specify something else, that the conflicts which forced withdrawal weren't resolved, only suspended. The Error epic, which describes Marduk's temporary abandonment of Babylon and Error's catastrophic rampage during his absence, ends not with permanent resolution, but with Marduk's return and Error's retreat. Not defeat, just retreat. The text implies that Error remains capable of acting again if circumstances allow. This pattern of suspended rather than resolved conflict appears throughout late Mesopotamian literature. The factions that fought during the final war didn't reconcile. They disengaged. And disengagement is temporary by nature. It lasts only as long as both sides choose not to re-engage. If this framework accurately represents the text's meaning, then the abandonment around 2000 BCE wasn't an ending, but an intermission. The Anunnaki withdrew from direct governance, but maintained capacity to return. The question becomes, under what conditions would return occur? The text suggests two primary triggers: breakdown of human governance systems beyond repair, or human development reaching thresholds that require divine intervention. The first appears in Error epic explicitly. When Babylon's systems collapse and chaos spreads beyond what human authority can contain, Marduk returns to restore order. The implication is that complete civilizational breakdown would trigger divine re-intervention, because allowing total collapse would waste everything the Anunnaki had invested in establishing Mesopotamian civilization. The second trigger appears more obliquely in texts describing forbidden knowledge and prohibited technologies. The Enochic literature, though not Mesopotamian in origin, preserves parallel traditions about knowledge, domains that divine beings prohibited humans from accessing without supervision. These prohibited domains include metallurgy, specifically weapons manufacturing, genetic knowledge, astronomical calculations enabling prediction and timing of cosmic events, and understanding of forces that could be weaponized. The prohibitions weren't about keeping humans ignorant, but about preventing them from developing capabilities they lacked wisdom to manage responsibly. If humans approached or exceeded these thresholds, it would trigger evaluation and potential intervention. Both triggers assume ongoing monitoring. The Anunnaki withdrew from direct governance, but didn't lose interest entirely. They established systems for observing human development and responding when conditions warranted. Whether such monitoring systems actually exist, or whether this represents a theological projection, humans imagining divine oversight because it makes existence feel more ordered and purposeful, cannot be determined from the texts alone. But the texts consistently describe reality as though monitoring continues. The administrative language persists even in late compositions. Gods still receive offerings. Temples still function as their earthly residences, maintained by human servants even when the gods aren't physically present. The infrastructure remains operational as though divine return is expected, and preparations must be maintained continuously. This expectation shaped Mesopotamian culture for thousands of years after Sumerian collapse. Babylonian kings claimed legitimacy through divine appointment. Assyrian rulers framed military campaigns as executing divine will. Even as political power shifted and cultures changed, the framework persisted. The Anunnaki departed but retained authority, and human rulers governed as their intermediaries. This framework remained functional until Mesopotamian civilization itself ended, not through internal collapse, but through conquest and cultural assimilation that gradually erased the religious and administrative structures that had preserved Anunnaki-focused theology. The Persian conquest in 539 BCE marked the beginning of this erosion. Persian religious frameworks centered on Ahura Mazda and Zoroastrian dualism, which didn't accommodate the Mesopotamian pantheon comfortably. The old gods remained in popular worship, but their administrative functions were displaced. Greek conquest under Alexander in 331 BCE accelerated the process. Hellenistic culture brought new gods, new languages, new administrative systems. The cuneiform scribal tradition that had preserved Sumerian and Akkadian texts for 3,000 years began declining. By the 1st century CE, cuneiform writing had essentially ceased. The last dated cuneiform tablet is an astronomical text from 75 CE. After that, silence. The scribal schools that had trained generations in reading and writing wedge-shaped signs on clay tablets closed. The knowledge they preserved became inaccessible. For over 1,500 years, the tablets sat unread, buried in ruins, scattered across museum collections, visible but incomprehensible. The Anunnaki, whose conflicts and governance had shaped the world's first literate civilization, became mythological footnotes remembered vaguely in biblical references and Greek philosophical speculations. Then 19th century archaeology began recovering the tablets. Henry Rawlinson deciphered Akkadian cuneiform in the 1850s. George Smith translated the flood narrative in 1872, shocking Victorian audiences with proof that biblical stories had Mesopotamian precedents. Excavations across Iraq throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s unearthed hundreds of thousands of tablets, and slowly the world the text described came back into focus. Not just mythology, but administrative records. Not just religious poetry, but legal codes, economic documents, historical chronicles. The Anunnaki reappeared not as vague ancient gods, but as specific entities, with names, cities, jurisdictions, and documented conflicts. The question we face now is whether those conflicts remain relevant, whether entities that governed Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago and then withdrew have any connection to current reality, whether the monitoring systems the text describe continue operating, whether the conditions that might trigger return are approaching or have already been crossed. The text can't answer these questions definitively. They preserve what happened, or what ancient scribes believed happened, during periods when the Anunnaki governed directly, and when they fought each other, and when they withdrew. But they can't prove those entities still exist, or still maintain interest in human affairs. What the text can do is provide framework for interpretation if events occur that match the patterns they describe. If technological development reaches thresholds the texts identify as prohibited, if civilizational systems collapse beyond human capacity to repair, if evidence emerges of monitoring or intervention from sources that don't fit conventional explanations, the framework exists, preserved in clay, waiting to be applied if circumstances warrant. Whether those circumstances will occur, whether the Anunnaki's withdrawal was temporary or permanent, whether their conflicts remain suspended or have been resolved through means the texts don't document, these remain open questions. What's certain is that the civilization they established ended catastrophically, that the texts describe that ending as resulting from their internal conflicts, and that the patterns of factional warfare, territorial disputes, and governance crises they documented 4,000 years ago remain recognizable in human political systems today. Perhaps that's the real legacy, not whether the Anunnaki were real or whether they might return, but the reminder that governance systems concentrating power without legitimate dispute resolution mechanisms inevitably fracture, that factions form when authorities disagree, that unresolved tensions escalate, and that conflicts between those who govern, when allowed to continue unchecked, eventually destroy what they were meant to protect. The tablets preserve that lesson in the most permanent medium Bronze Age technology could create: pressed clay, baked hard, surviving fires and floods and millennia of burial. The words remain, the warnings remain, and the questions they raise about power, conflict, and the price of unresolved governance crises remain as relevant now as when scribes first pressed them into wet clay 4,000 years ago. The weapons described in that fragmentary tablet, the one mentioning Anunnaki war against Anunnaki, don't map onto anything Bronze Age armies possessed. Fire that burns without flame suggests energy release without combustion. Land poisoned for 3 harvests suggests contamination that persists in soil, affecting successive plantings, not temporary destruction from fire or siege. The phrase appears in Akkadian, a language that had extensive vocabulary for weapons and warfare. Mesopotamian texts describe swords, spears, bows, siege equipment, chariots, all with precise terminology, distinguishing types and functions. When scribes wanted to describe conventional weapons, they had exact words. The fragment doesn't use those words. It uses descriptive phrases, attempting to characterize something the standard vocabulary couldn't capture. That's what you'd expect if observers encountered technology so far beyond their experience that they could only approximate its effects through analogy. Burns without flame, because it produces heat or destruction resembling fire, but without visible flames. Poisons the earth because it renders land unusable, but through mechanisms that aren't immediately visible like salting fields or burning crops would be. Modern readers have vocabulary the Bronze Age scribes lacked. We can hypothesize about energy weapons, radiation, chemical contamination, biological agents. Whether any of these match what the text describes can't be determined from the fragment alone. But the pattern is clear. The weapons function differently from anything in the scribe's normal experience of warfare. The city mentioned, possibly Shuruppak, presents additional complications. Shuruppak appears in multiple early Sumerian texts as one of the 5 antediluvian cities, one of the cities that existed before the flood. Archaeological excavations at the site identified with ancient Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, show occupation layers dating back to the early dynastic period around 2900 BCE, but the site was abandoned around 2000 BCE, the same period when and other southern Mesopotamian cities collapsed. The archaeological record shows typical destruction, burned buildings, collapsed, walls, but nothing that would explain why birds wouldn't sing there for 40 years afterward. As the fragment claims, no birds singing for 40 years suggests environmental contamination that affected wildlife across multiple generations. That's not what normal siege destruction produces. Battles kill people and destroy buildings, but wildlife returns quickly once fighting ends. 40 years of ecological silence suggests something interfered with bird populations specifically, or with the environment broadly enough that birds couldn't survive there. Whether this represents accurate observation, exaggeration, or symbolic description can't be determined. But it's consistent with the pattern. Destruction using methods that produced effects exceeding what conventional Bronze Age warfare should create. The Lamentation for Nippur, another text from this period, describes similar environmental aftermath. After the city's destruction, the text states that wild animals avoided the ruins. The fields around Nippur produced nothing even after farmers returned and attempted cultivation. The text describes this barrenness lasting until the gods turn their faces back, suggesting indefinite duration. Nippur was Enlil's primary cult centre, the religious heart of Sumerian civilization. Its destruction carried symbolic weight beyond military or political significance. But the text doesn't frame this as symbolic. It describes material consequences: failed crops, absent wildlife, land that refused to recover. If Enlil's faction and Enki's faction had fought to conclusive confrontation around 2000 BCE, Nippur would be an obvious target. Destroying Enlil's primary sanctuary would demonstrate Enki's faction's power and willingness to violate what should have been inviolable religious sites. Conversely, if Enlil's faction destroyed cities associated with rival Anunnaki, the destructions at Uruk, and Eridu make strategic sense as eliminating Enki's power bases. The texts don't specify which faction initiated the final conflicts or which achieved better outcomes. They describe mutual destruction without clear victors. Both sides lost cities, both sides withdrew. The pattern suggests stalemate achieved through mutual exhaustion rather than decisive victory for either faction. That outcome makes sense if both sides possessed comparable capabilities. If one faction had overwhelming advantage, the war would have ended quickly with that faction imposing terms on the defeated. Extended conflict producing mutual devastation suggests rough parity, both sides capable of inflicting damage, neither able to achieve complete victory without unacceptable costs. Eventually, costs exceeded benefits. Continuing the fight would destroy remaining infrastructure, kill remaining populations, and render the entire Mesopotamian plain unusable. Both factions apparently recognized this and chose withdrawal over mutual annihilation, but withdrawal required trust that the opposing faction wouldn't use the disengagement as opportunity to rebuild strength and resume conflict later. The texts don't describe formal peace negotiations or treaty terms. They simply document that both sides departed. Perhaps trust wasn't necessary if both sides established monitoring systems ensuring the other couldn't rebuild unopposed. Perhaps the withdrawal was geographical rather than complete, with both factions retreating to defendable positions outside Mesopotamia while maintaining observation capacity over the region they'd abandoned. The texts describe the Anunnaki departing to distant mountains and the boundary of heaven, phrases that could indicate actual geographic locations outside the Mesopotamian plain. Mountain regions to the north and east, the Zagros, the Taurus, the Caucasus, appear in various texts as places where divine beings maintained strongholds separate from their city temples. Archaeological surveys in some of these regions have detected anomalies, large underground chambers at depths exceeding known ancient mining operations, geometric precision in carved passages that seems inconsistent with Bronze Age tools, sealed doorways that no documented excavation created. Access to many of these sites is restricted due to military zones or political complications, preventing systematic investigation. The accounts that do exist come from unofficial explorations and describe features that don't fit conventional archaeological expectations. Chambers with smooth walls showing no tool marks, passages extending farther than handheld lights can illuminate, metallic surfaces that show no corrosion despite obvious age. These accounts are difficult to verify and easily dismissed as misidentifications or fabrications, but they persist across different time periods from independent sources. If the Anunnaki established defensive installations in mountain regions and withdrew to those positions after the Mesopotamian conflicts, some of those installations might remain. Whether they remain operational, whether they contain anything beyond empty chambers, whether they were ever anything more than natural caves that Bronze Age populations modified for storage or ritual use. These questions can't be answered without access and investigation that current political situations prevent. What the texts do make clear is that withdrawal wasn't abandonment of interest. The temple systems continued, offerings continued. The administrative structure that treated gods as present entities requiring material support persisted for thousands of years after the Anunnaki ceased direct governance. This suggests the populations who maintained those systems believed or acted as though they believed that the gods remained involved despite physical absence. That divine return was possible and perhaps expected under conditions the texts sometimes specify and sometimes leave implicit. Babylonian and Assyrian kings routinely claimed that their military campaigns and building projects were commanded by gods through dreams or oracles. Whether this represents actual communication, political legitimization through religious authority, or sincere belief that indirect signs constituted divine instruction, the framework remained operational. The gods were absent but not gone, distant but not powerless, withdrawn but not disinterested. This framework created expectation of return, not immediate return, but eventual return, when circumstances warranted or when cosmic cycles reached appropriate phases. Mesopotamian astronomy developed sophisticated understanding of planetary movements, eclipse cycles, and precessional shifts, precisely because these celestial patterns were believed to indicate divine timing mechanisms. If return was scheduled according to astronomical configurations rather than arbitrary divine whim, then tracking those configurations became urgent religious and political necessity. Missing the signs could mean being unprepared when divine intervention occurred. Misreading them could prompt premature action, expecting return that wasn't imminent. The astronomical texts that survive, mathematical calculations of planetary positions, eclipse prediction tables, observational logs spanning centuries, demonstrate remarkable precision. This precision required long-term systematic observation that presumes the knowledge mattered for practical rather than merely theoretical purposes. What those purposes were, the texts rarely specify directly, but the implication remains consistent. Certain celestial configurations indicated appropriate timing for significant divine actions, and tracking those configurations enabled prediction of when such actions might occur. Whether any configurations approaching in current or near future astronomical conditions match the patterns ancient texts identified as significant is a technical question requiring expertise in both Mesopotamian astronomy and modern celestial mechanics. But the question is legitimate. The text preserves sufficient data that correlation could theoretically be calculated. If correlations exist, if current astronomical conditions approach configurations the texts marked as significant, that wouldn't prove anything about Anunnaki return. It would merely establish that timing mechanisms the texts describe are reaching indicated thresholds. What happens when those thresholds are reached? Whether anything responds to astronomical triggers, or whether the correlations are coincidental, would only be determined through observation. The texts can't predict the future. They can only preserve what ancient scribes believed about past events, and about patterns they thought those events followed. Whether those beliefs accurately describe reality operating according to principles we don't yet recognise, or whether they represent sophisticated mythology that accidentally correlates with astronomical data, remains the question suspended between what we've verified and what we wonder about. The institutional memory problem compounds everything. If the events described in Sumerian texts occurred during periods predating continuous written records, and if catastrophic disruptions destroyed observational continuity multiple times, then evidence would survive only in fragmentary form. We'd have accounts without the administrative infrastructure that generated them, claims without the verification systems that would confirm them. The cuneiform tradition lasted approximately 3 millennia before disappearing in the early centuries CE. During those 3,000 years, tablets were copied, recopied, translated between languages, transmitted across cultural boundaries. The knowledge they contained remained embedded in texts whose religious and administrative importance ensured preservation even when technical understanding faded. When cuneiform writing finally ceased, the tablets became unreadable for over 15 centuries, until 19th century decipherment recovered access. This 15-century gap represents exactly the kind of knowledge discontinuity the texts themselves describe as recurring through history. Civilizational collapse disrupts information transmission, leaving subsequent cultures to rediscover what previous populations possessed. The pattern the texts identify as characteristic of post-catastrophe periods matches what actually occurred between the last cuneiform tablet and modern archaeological recovery. We are, in effect, a post-discontinuity civilization that regained access to records from pre-discontinuity sources. What we find in those recovered texts is sophisticated astronomical knowledge, advanced mathematical calculations, detailed chronologies spanning immense periods, and consistent claims about non-human entities establishing civilization's foundations. The sophistication argues against dismissing them as primitive mythology. The consistency across independent sources suggests shared information rather than coincidental invention. But the gap between when texts were written and when we regained ability to read them creates uncertainty about how much was lost in transmission. The tablets we've recovered may represent fragments of larger knowledge systems. The texts may reference other documents that haven't survived. Technical terminology may have been corrupted through copying errors accumulating across centuries. We work with incomplete and possibly degraded versions of information that was originally more comprehensive. This uncertainty is built into the situation. We cannot recover what was lost during discontinuity periods. We cannot know what additional texts existed in libraries that were destroyed or remain buried in unexcavated sites. Yet what survived is remarkable. The astronomical precision encoded in monuments and texts indicates knowledge requiring centuries of observation. The mathematical sophistication demonstrated in architectural proportions and calendrical calculations shows capabilities supposedly unavailable in those periods. The consistency of flood narratives across independent cultures suggests shared memory of actual events, rather than merely parallel mythological development. The cumulative pattern of surviving evidence supports the text's claims that knowledge was inherited from earlier sources rather than invented independently by each civilization. Whether those sources were pre-flood human civilizations or non-human entities, the texts call Anunnaki remains unresolved. But that knowledge transmission occurred from sources predating the historical civilizations that recorded it seems increasingly difficult to deny. This transmission framework requires accepting that sophisticated understanding existed during periods when conventional chronology places only primitive populations. It requires acknowledging gaps in the archaeological record where advanced civilizations might have existed but left limited traces, perhaps because cities concentrated in coastal regions now underwater, perhaps because catastrophic events destroyed physical evidence, perhaps because preservation conditions prevented survival of materials documenting their existence. Underwater archaeological sites discovered off India, Japan and the Mediterranean demonstrate that urban development did occur in areas now submerged. The Younger Dryas impact evidence confirms that catastrophic events destroyed civilizations during periods when flood traditions placed their narratives. Preservation bias in archaeology towards stone structures means civilizations building primarily with organic materials would leave minimal traces even if sophisticated. Each factor individually provides plausible explanation for why advanced pre-flood civilizations might not appear prominently in conventional archaeological record. Collectively, they suggest that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence when dealing with periods separated from us by multiple catastrophic discontinuities. The ancient texts provide frameworks for understanding what that missing record might contain. They describe urban civilizations possessing advanced knowledge during periods thousands of years before conventional chronology places such development. They attribute this knowledge to teaching from non-human sources and document its partial preservation through catastrophic events that disrupted but didn't entirely eliminate information. Whether these frameworks accurately represent historical reality or are mythological constructs ancient, peoples used to explain knowledge whose actual origins they didn't understand remains the question evidence hasn't definitively answered, but the question is increasingly recognized as legitimate rather than merely speculative. The evidence is sufficient to justify serious investigation, even if it doesn't yet compel specific conclusions. Each underwater site surveyed, each ancient text translated, each genetic sequence analysed adds data that either supports or challenges various interpretive frameworks. The accumulation is gradual. The pattern that emerges remains ambiguous, but the direction trends toward more information rather than less. The ancient texts themselves seem designed to enable this gradual revelation. They preserve information in forms remaining accessible across multiple interpretive stages, functioning as religious literature for populations not yet ready for technical interpretation, then as historical documents for populations developing capability to recognize embedded knowledge, then potentially as operational manuals for populations developing capability to use preserved information. If this graduated revelation is intentional design, it represents sophisticated information encoding ensuring knowledge survives across civilizational collapses while becoming progressively more useful as recovering civilizations redevelop capability. Whether texts actually represent such sophisticated design or accidentally possess characteristics enabling multiple interpretations depends on assumptions about original authors' intentions. If authors merely recorded mythology, technical interpretations we find may represent our projections rather than their intentions. If authors deliberately encoded knowledge for future recovery, technical interpretations may align with actual purposes. The texts cannot definitively resolve this question, but certain features suggest intentionality. Astronomical data precision embedded in monument proportions, numerical relationship consistency across independent traditions, multi-layered structure allowing texts to function simultaneously as religious narrative and technical documentation. These characteristics would be difficult to produce accidentally. The alternative, that ancient peoples accidentally created texts functioning as sophisticated information encoding systems while intending merely to record religious beliefs, requires accepting that remarkable effectiveness emerged without design. That's possible, but seems less parsimonious than accepting texts may function as designed because they were designed for these purposes. If texts were designed for graduated knowledge revelation, we may approach the stage where the next layer becomes accessible, where technical content remaining embedded but unrecognized becomes interpretable as our capabilities develop, where information surviving through discontinuity periods becomes operational again as we recover ability to understand and use it. What that next layer might contain, what knowledge might be encoded in texts we've read multiple times without recognizing all they preserve, remains unknown. But the texts themselves suggest that understanding comes not from decipherment alone, but from developing capabilities that make the information relevant and usable. A Bronze Age population reading instructions for genetic engineering would see meaningless technical jargon. A modern population with CRISPR technology reads the same text and recognizes procedural descriptions. The information hasn't changed. The capacity to recognize and use it has. If the Sumerian texts preserve information about Anunnaki conflicts, about weapons that exceeded Bronze Age capabilities, about governance structures managing advanced civilizations, about monitoring systems and scheduled returns, that information becomes interpretable only when we develop context, making it recognizable. We may have reached that stage. We possess genetic engineering. We understand radiation and chemical weapons. We recognize administrative systems and territorial disputes. We comprehend the physics that would make certain weapon effects possible. The vocabulary and frameworks that Bronze Age that scribes lacked, we now possess, which means we can reread the text through technical rather than purely mythological or historical lenses. We can ask whether descriptions of weapons that burn without flame match energy, release mechanisms we understand, whether accounts of divine genetic engineering map onto procedures we've developed, whether territorial disputes between Anunnaki administrators resemble political conflicts we recognize. The texts don't change when we do this, but what we can see in them does. And what becomes visible might include information that was always present, but invisible to populations lacking conceptual tools to recognize it. Whether that information describes actual historical events, or represents sophisticated mythology that coincidentally resembles technical descriptions remains debatable, but the debate has shifted from whether the text deserves serious investigation to what methodology appropriately investigates them. That shift matters. It represents recognition that dismissing these texts as primitive mythology might be premature, that they might preserve knowledge we need frameworks to access, and that developing those frameworks requires treating the texts as potentially encoding accurate information, even if we can't yet verify that accuracy. The Anunnaki's final war, if it occurred, left traces in texts that survived multiple civilizational collapses. Those traces describe factional conflicts, advanced weapons, environmental destruction, and withdrawal rather than resolution. They describe monitoring systems and potential returns. They describe knowledge deliberately preserved for populations that would eventually redevelop capacity to understand it, whether we are that population, whether our current capabilities make us ready to access what the texts preserve, whether anything we might discover would confirm the Anunnaki were real entities whose conflicts actually occurred. These questions remain open, but they're no longer dismissible. The texts exist. The patterns they describe are consistent. The evidence supporting some claims is accumulating, and the possibility that we're reading historical documentation rather than mythology can't be eliminated without explaining why mythology would preserve such specific, consistent, and technically detailed accounts across millennia. The question of what to do with these claims matters more than whether they can be definitively verified. Even without absolute confirmation, the patterns they describe contain insights about governance, conflict escalation, and the consequences of unresolved factional disputes that remain relevant regardless of whether ancient monitoring systems actually exist. The texts identify specific conditions as dangerous when present without adequate management structures, concentrated power without legitimate dispute resolution, factional divisions within ruling hierarchies, territorial ambiguities creating overlapping jurisdictions, and resource competition without agreed arbitration mechanisms. These are precisely the conditions that characterized Anunnaki governance according to the texts, and they're precisely the conditions that eventually produced catastrophic conflict. Whether anyone is watching this pattern repeat in human systems is less important than whether the pattern itself carries inherent risks that the ancient warnings attempted to identify. The dangers are real, whether or not divine oversight makes them additionally concerning. What the Sumerian accounts preserve, beneath all questions about their factual accuracy, is testimony from the world's oldest literate civilization about how they understood power structures, factional conflicts, and the breakdown of governance systems. They saw authority as fragile, maintained through continuous negotiation, rather than permanent decree. They recognized that those who govern can disagree fundamentally about how to govern. They documented what happens when those disagreements exceed the system's capacity to contain them peacefully. Whether this accurately describes Anunnaki conflicts or merely reflects how Mesopotamian populations understood their own political instability, it reveals assumptions about power and conflict that shaped their civilization. Those assumptions differ from modern frameworks, emphasizing democratic legitimacy and institutional checks on power. The Sumerian model was hierarchical, authoritarian, and ultimately unstable precisely because it concentrated authority without providing mechanisms for resolving disputes between those who held it. The Anunnaki Council could make decisions, but it couldn't enforce compliance when powerful members defied those decisions. Enki sabotaged the flood decree and faced no consequences. The Tablet of Destinies was stolen repeatedly. Territorial disputes between cities escalated into conflicts their patron deities backed rather than mediated. Every mechanism meant to prevent conflict became an object of conflict itself. This pattern reveals fundamental weakness in governance structures that rely on consensus among the powerful without providing enforcement mechanisms when consensus breaks down. If those who govern cannot agree, and if no higher authority can compel agreement, the system fragments, factions form, conflicts escalate, and resolution comes through force rather than negotiation. The text suggests the Anunnaki learned this slowly, through escalating crises that eventually forced recognition that their governance model was fundamentally flawed. But by the time they recognized it, the infrastructure they'd built had been damaged, the populations they governed had been decimated, and continuing the conflicts would destroy everything remaining. Withdrawal was acknowledgement of failure, not military failure, but systemic failure. The model that had maintained order for millennia collapsed under the weight of unresolved internal contradictions. Rather than reform the system, which would require the competing factions to cooperate in ways they'd proven unable to do, they disengaged. Whether this represents actual historical events or merely serves as allegory for human political dysfunction, the lesson remains valid. Governance systems that concentrate power without legitimate dispute resolution mechanisms eventually fracture. The more powerful the disputants, the more catastrophic the fracture. And systems that survive do so not through eliminating conflict, which is impossible when intelligent beings disagree, but through channeling conflict into resolution mechanisms that don't require destroying the system to determine outcomes. Modern democratic systems attempt this through elections, courts, constitutional frameworks, and peaceful transitions of power. These mechanisms aren't perfect, but they provide alternatives to violence when leaders disagree. The Anunnaki apparently lacked such mechanisms, or the mechanisms they had failed when tested by fundamental disagreements that couldn't be resolved through existing procedures. The result was war, not immediately, but eventually. After centuries of accumulated tensions, unresolved disputes, and factional divisions that weakened the system's resilience until a sufficient crisis triggered collapse. If the texts preserve accurate historical memory, this offers cautionary insight into how advanced civilizations fail. Not through external conquest necessarily, not through environmental collapse necessarily, but through internal conflicts that governance structures can't contain. The more advanced the civilization, the more destructive the weapons available when conflicts escalate. The Anunnaki possessed capabilities that allowed them to poison land for generations and destroy cities with weapons that didn't match Bronze Age norms. When those capabilities were deployed in internal conflicts, the damage exceeded anything external threats could have produced. Humanity is approaching similar thresholds. We possess weapons that can poison environments for generations. We have technologies whose misuse could cause damage, persisting far beyond the conflicts that might deploy them. We have competing power centres with fundamental disagreements about governance, resource distribution, and authority that existing international structures struggle to mediate effectively. Whether this triggers intervention from monitoring systems the texts describe, or whether it merely represents humans repeating patterns that other civilizations have experienced, the trajectory carries risks. Unresolved conflicts between nuclear powers, competition over resources in contexts where force remains an available option, factional divisions within and between nations that exceed institutional capacity to mediate. These are conditions the texts identify as precursors to catastrophic outcomes. The warnings are ancient, but the patterns they describe are contemporary. Whether those warnings came from entities who witnessed similar patterns before, or whether they represent human wisdom about political dynamics that transcend specific historical contexts, they deserve consideration. The texts can't tell us whether we're observed. They can't prove that the Anunnaki were real or that their conflicts actually occurred. They can't demonstrate that monitoring systems remain operational, or that returns are scheduled for when humanity reaches particular thresholds. But they can remind us that civilizations before us face questions about power, conflict, and governance that they couldn't resolve peacefully. That concentrating capabilities without developing wisdom produces catastrophe. That disputes between the powerful, when allowed to escalate, unchecked, destroy what they were supposed to protect. And that withdrawal, when it occurs, doesn't mean conflicts are resolved, only that they're suspended until conditions change sufficiently to make re-engagement possible or necessary. The night deepens toward hours when thinking becomes clearer and questions feel more pressing. The tablets remain in their cases, holding silent testimony. The claims they preserve about beings who descended, about knowledge that was taught, about cycles that repeat, about conflicts that ended in mutual withdrawal, persist in the space between what we've proven and what we suspect. Whether those claims describe events that actually occurred, whether the entities they name were real, whether the conflicts they document happened as described, these questions remain open. The evidence admits multiple interpretations. The texts can be read as mythology or as history, as allegory or as documentation, as theological construct or as eyewitness account filtered through scribal tradition. But what cannot be denied is that the world's oldest bureaucracy preserved these claims with the same precision they used to track grain and silver, that they measured impossible chronologies using mathematical units they applied accurately in every other domain, that they described knowledge transmission, governance structures, and factional conflicts with specificity unusual for purely mythological literature, that they documented weapons, territories, and administrative procedures with detail, suggesting actual systems rather than invented narratives. The tablets sit in museum cases now, pressed clay, holding claims we can read but cannot fully evaluate. The evidence they preserve remains suspended between documentation and mythology, between what we can verify and what we wonder about, between silence that might indicate absence and silence that might indicate things we don't yet recognize as speaking. The questions they raise about origins, purpose, governance, and conflict persist across the 5,000 years since scribes first pressed these accounts into wet clay. Perhaps that persistence is the point. Perhaps the texts were preserved not to provide definitive answers, but to maintain questions each generation must reconsider with new evidence and fresh perspectives, to keep open the possibility that reality is more complex than current frameworks accommodate, to prevent premature closure on mysteries whose resolution may require evidence we don't yet possess or conceptual tools we haven't yet developed, to remind us that what we dismiss as mythology might preserve memories we need but aren't yet ready to recognize. The ancient accounts cannot prove we're observed. They cannot demonstrate that the Anunnaki's conflicts were real, or that their withdrawal was temporary. They cannot show that return mechanisms exist, or that thresholds approach. But they can remind us that civilizations before us asked similar questions about origins, purpose, and the entities that might govern beyond visible structures, and that those civilizations considered the answers significant enough to preserve across catastrophes, transmissions, and the long silence of centuries when no one could read what had been written. The administrative tablets recovered from Shurapak, the city the fragmentary text mentions as possibly damaged by weapons in the Anunnaki conflicts, show something unusual in their final layers. The tablets from the city's last decades of occupation, dated to approximately 2600 BCE, demonstrate sudden shifts in record-keeping practices. Earlier tablets follow consistent formats developed over centuries: grain rations listed by worker category, livestock inventories organised by herd and shepherd, textile production tracked by weaver and workshop. The bureaucratic system functioned with remarkable stability, suggesting administrative continuity across generations. Then the format changes. Later tablets show abbreviated entries, inconsistent terminology, and gaps in sequential numbering that suggest missing records. The handwriting becomes less uniform, as though multiple scribes with different training levels were pressed into service rapidly. Some tablets record unusual allocations, emergency provisions, evacuation supplies, defensive preparations, using vocabulary that appears rarely in earlier administrative contexts. These aren't the records of a city conducting normal business. They're the records of a city under stress, possibly under threat, reorganising rapidly for circumstances the earlier bureaucratic formats weren't designed to handle. Then the tablets cease. The site shows destruction consistent with fire and abandonment. When occupation resumed generations later, it was on a smaller scale, without the administrative sophistication the earlier city had maintained. Whether this destruction relates to the conflicts the fragmentary text describes cannot be determined from the tablets alone. But the pattern, administrative stress, unusual preparations, sudden destruction, diminished recovery, matches what you'd expect if the city faced threats its normal governance systems couldn't manage. Similar patterns appear at other sites. Uruk's administrative archives show disruption around 2100 BCE. Nippur's temple records have gaps during periods when the city should have been functioning normally. Ur's latest tablets, before its final abandonment record, emergency measures and resource reallocations that suggest crisis management rather than routine administration. Individually, these disruptions could represent local conflicts, environmental stresses, or economic problems. Collectively, across multiple independent cities during overlapping time periods, they suggest systemic crisis affecting the entire southern Mesopotamian region simultaneously. The texts frame this crisis as divine conflict. The archaeology shows cities under stress, conducting emergency preparations, then experiencing destructions that ended or severely disrupted occupation. Whether divine conflict caused the stress, or whether the texts used divine conflict as framework to explain disasters whose actual causes they didn't understand, the outcome was civilizational collapse across the region. The human cost appears in the lamentation texts with specificity that suggests witness testimony. The lamentation for describes refugees fleeing the city only to find surrounding regions equally devastated. It describes mothers abandoning children they couldn't feed. It describes corpses filling irrigation canals, blocking water flow and contaminating what water remained. These details don't serve obvious theological purposes. They don't justify divine anger or explain moral lessons. They simply document suffering with the matter-of-fact precision you'd expect from scribes trained to record observations accurately. If the texts preserve eyewitness accounts of actual events, then what they describe wasn't merely military conquest, but comprehensive catastrophe that destroyed agricultural systems, displaced populations, and rendered previously productive regions uninhabitable. The scale exceeds what Bronze Age armies could achieve through conventional siege and battle, which returns attention to the weapons the fragmentary text describes: burning without flame, poisoning land for years. If such weapons were actually deployed during conflicts between Anunnaki factions, they would produce exactly the effects the Lamentations document: environmental damage persisting beyond the conflicts themselves, agricultural collapse, population displacement, and long recovery periods. Whether weapons with these characteristics existed in Bronze Age Mesopotamia cannot be confirmed archaeologically. No physical weapons matching these descriptions have been recovered. No residues indicating advanced chemical or radiological agents have been detected in destruction layers, though such residues might not survive 4,000 years, or might appear in forms we wouldn't recognise as weapon-related. The absence of physical evidence doesn't disprove the text's claims, but it prevents confirmation. We're left with detailed textual descriptions of events that archaeology shows occurred. Cities were destroyed, populations displaced, civilization collapsed, but without ability to verify the specific mechanisms the texts attribute to that destruction. This interpretive gap will likely remain unless new evidence emerges, either archaeological finds confirming advanced weapons use, or additional texts providing clearer technical descriptions, or contemporary accounts from other cultures documenting similar events with different perspective. Egyptian texts from the late 3rd millennium BCE describe chaos in Syria and Palestine, disruption of trade networks, and waves of migrants fleeing conflicts in the north. Whether these relate to the Mesopotamian catastrophes or represent independent regional collapses is unclear, but the timing overlaps sufficiently to suggest connection. The texts don't describe Anunnaki conflicts. Egyptian theology operated through different frameworks with different divine hierarchies, but they do describe regional instability, failed states, and populations in crisis during the same general period when Sumerian civilization collapsed. If the Anunnaki conflicts were real events, they wouldn't have affected only Mesopotamia. Trade networks connected the entire Near East. Political relationships linked Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia in webs of alliance and competition. Major conflicts in one region would produce ripple effects in others. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE demonstrates this interconnection clearly. When the Mycenaean palatial system collapsed, when the Hittite Empire fell, when Egyptian trade networks failed, the entire Eastern Mediterranean descended into Dark Age simultaneously. No single cause explains all the collapses, but the interconnection meant that failure in one system amplified failures in others. The Sumerian collapse around 2000 BCE may represent an earlier instance of the same pattern. Conflicts in southern Mesopotamia, disrupting trade networks, triggering migrations, destabilizing neighbouring regions, producing cascading failures across interconnected political and economic systems. If Anunnaki factions fought using advanced weapons, the direct destruction in Mesopotamia would be compounded by indirect consequences spreading through trade and political networks to regions far beyond the primary conflict zones. Egyptian texts describing chaos in the Levant might reflect those indirect consequences, but this remains speculative. The connections are plausible but unproven. The evidence admits the interpretation but doesn't require it. And without additional data, the question of whether the Anunnaki conflicts were real events affecting the entire Near East, or merely Mesopotamian theological explanations for local disasters cannot be resolved definitively. What can be stated with confidence is that something extraordinary happened around 2000 BCE. The civilization that had defined southern Mesopotamia for over a millennium collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Administrative systems failed. The language shifted from Sumerian to Akkadian. Political power relocated northward to Babylon. And the text describing this collapse attributed it to conflicts between divine administrators who had governed those cities, using weapons that exceeded normal capabilities, producing destruction that poisoned land and displaced populations. Whether those divine administrators were real entities or theological constructs, whether the weapons were real technologies or poetic descriptions of conventional warfare's trauma, whether the conflicts actually occurred as described or were invented to explain disasters whose true causes were obscure, these questions remain suspended between competing interpretations that current evidence cannot decisively adjudicate. But the questions themselves matter. They remind us that civilizations collapse not merely through environmental failure or external conquest, but through internal conflicts that governance structures cannot contain. They suggest that concentrating power without developing dispute resolution mechanisms creates instability that eventually produces catastrophe. They warn that capabilities deployed in internal conflicts produce damage exceeding what external threats could achieve, and they preserve, in the oldest written records humanity possesses, testimony about events whose causes remain debated, but whose consequences, civilizational collapse, population displacement, cultural discontinuity, are archaeologically confirmed. The tablets hold that testimony with patient permanence. The questions they raise about power, conflict, and the fragility of even the most sophisticated civilizations remain as relevant now as when scribes first pressed them into wet clay 4,000 years ago, and somewhere in the space between what the texts describe and what archaeology confirms, between mythology and history, between dismissal and verification, the possibility remains that what happened to the Anunnaki cities might offer insights about what happens when those who govern cannot agree on how to govern, and when the weapons they possess exceed the wisdom they've developed to constrain their use. The silence that followed Sumer's collapse lasted longer than the civilization that preceded it. Southern Mesopotamia remained sparsely populated for centuries. The great cities, Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, were eventually reoccupied, but on smaller scales, without the administrative complexity or political power they'd once commanded. Political authority shifted northward to Babylon, which rose to dominance under Hammurabi around 1750 BCE. The Babylonians inherited Sumerian cuneiform, adopted Sumerian religious texts, and worshipped the same gods with Akkadian names. But they didn't rebuild what had been destroyed. They created something new from the fragments that survived. The Anunnaki remained central to Babylonian theology, but the relationship had changed. They were no longer described as resident administrators governing cities directly. They became more distant, more cosmic, approached through elaborate ritual and interpreted through priestly specialists rather than encountered in straightforward administrative transactions. Whether this shift reflected actual change in divine presence or merely theological evolution, adapting to new political realities, cannot be determined from the texts. But the contrast is stark. Early Sumerian texts treat interactions with Anunnaki as routine administrative matters. Later, Babylonian texts treat such interactions as extraordinary events requiring specialized knowledge and careful protocol. Something had ended, whether divine beings actually withdrew or whether human populations lost access to systems that had previously functioned. The outcome was the same. The direct governance model that characterized early dynastic and the Third periods didn't continue into the old Babylonian period. The Lamentations describe this as divine abandonment, the gods departing, leaving their cities to face destruction without protection. The archaeological record shows those cities were indeed destroyed, and that recovery, when it occurred, happened under different political and cultural frameworks. Whether divine abandonment caused the destruction, or whether destruction prompted theological explanations involving divine abandonment, the texts preserve memory of a fundamental rupture. What had existed before, direct governance by non-human administrators, ended. What came after operated differently, through mediation and interpretation, rather than direct contact. This pattern of presence, followed by withdrawal, appears across multiple ancient traditions beyond Mesopotamia. Egyptian texts describe earlier ages when gods ruled directly on earth, followed by later periods when they governed indirectly through pharaohs who served as their representatives. Greek traditions preserve memories of ages when gods mingled freely with humans, followed by withdrawal as humanity entered the Iron Age. Biblical texts describe a progression from direct divine presence in Eden to increasingly mediated communication through prophets and angels. Whether these parallel traditions preserve independent memories of similar transitions, or whether they represent common mythological patterns humans develop to explain perceived distance from the divine, they suggest the theme of withdrawal resonates across cultures. The Sumerian version adds specificity the others lack: weapons, factions, territorial disputes, administrative procedures, where Greek mythology presents withdrawal as Zeus decreeing that God should no longer interfere directly in human affairs. Sumerian texts frame it as consequence of conflicts that damaged the infrastructure divine administrators had built. The distinction matters. Divine decree suggests planned transition, theological evolution toward human autonomy. Conflict-forced withdrawal suggests unintended outcome, pragmatic disengagement when continuing direct governance became unsustainable after factional warfare destroyed too much of what made that governance functional. If the Sumerian framework preserves more accurate memory, then withdrawal wasn't gift of autonomy, but abandonment by necessity. The Anunnaki didn't choose to elevate humanity by stepping back. They withdrew because continuing to fight each other while maintaining direct governance would destroy everything remaining. This reading casts human civilization's development after 2000 BCE in different light, not progressive evolution toward autonomy and self-governance, but survival and recovery after being left to manage systems we were taught to operate but not to design. The knowledge required for those systems, agriculture, irrigation, metallurgy, writing, mathematics, astronomy, was preserved. The texts describe it as having been taught originally by Anunnaki, and whether that's accurate or mythological, the knowledge persisted through the collapse and enabled eventual recovery. But the understanding of why those systems were designed as they were, what principles guided their construction, what purposes they served beyond immediate function, this deeper knowledge may not have survived. We inherited operational procedures without necessarily understanding the theories behind them. This would explain why certain ancient knowledge seems extraordinarily sophisticated for its period, while also seeming isolated, lacking the developmental context that typically surrounds major innovations. Writing appears essentially complete in its earliest attestations. Mathematical systems function at high sophistication from their first documented uses. Astronomical knowledge exists at precision levels, requiring observational programs we can't document in the archaeological record. If this knowledge was taught rather than developed indigenously, it would appear exactly as it does. Sophisticated but contextless, functional but theoretically unexplained, preserved through tradition but not fully understood by those who preserved it. The tablets themselves exemplify this. Sumerian scribes copied tablets for 3,000 years, preserving texts they sometimes didn't fully understand, maintaining knowledge through disruptions and transitions that might otherwise have lost it. They preserved it because the traditions they inherited taught that preservation mattered, even when the reasons preservation mattered had become obscure. Whether they preserved it for us specifically, for populations that would eventually redevelop, capabilities making the information relevant again, or whether they preserved it simply because that's what scribes do, the outcome is the same. The knowledge survived, the texts survived, and we can now read them with frameworks our Bronze Age predecessors lacked. What we find when we read them with those frameworks is testimony about governance structures that failed through internal conflicts, about weapons that exceeded conventional capabilities, about knowledge that was taught rather than discovered, and about entities whose conflicts shaped civilizational development in ways that might extend beyond Mesopotamian antiquity. We find questions we cannot answer definitively, but also cannot dismiss without explaining why the world's oldest written records would preserve such specific, consistent, and technically detailed accounts if they documented nothing real. The evidence remains what it always was: fragmentary, ancient, filtered through cultural frameworks we don't entirely understand, preserved in language that took centuries to decipher. The texts describe events we cannot verify, but also cannot absolutely disprove. They preserve patterns that might represent history, or might represent sophisticated mythology we don't yet fully recognise as mythology. And they sit in museum cases now, pressed clay holding silent testimony about conflicts that may have ended civilizations, about withdrawals that may have been strategic rather than permanent, about monitoring that may continue even in absence, about returns that may be scheduled according to mechanisms we haven't identified or may never occur at all. The questions persist, the patterns remain, and somewhere in the space between what we've proven and what we wonder about, the possibility endures that what the tablets describe about the Anunnaki's final war might preserve memory worth considering, not as established fact, but as testimony that refuses easy dismissal, as evidence that admits multiple interpretations without requiring any single one, as documentation that might mean more than we currently recognise, or might mean exactly what conventional scholarship suggests: ancient peoples making sense of catastrophes through theological frameworks that reflected their understanding of power, conflict, and the forces that shape civilizations. The tablets offer no final answers. They preserve questions that each generation must evaluate with whatever evidence and frameworks they possess, and they remind us, with permanence, that survives millennia, that civilizations fail, that governance structures fracture, that those who hold power can disagree fundamentally about how to use it, and that the consequences of those disagreements, when they escalate beyond containment, reshape the world in ways that echo across thousands of years. The night holds both the questions and the silence. The ancient accounts persist in patient preservation, and the possibility remains, however unverifiable, that what ended in Mesopotamian clay 4,000 years ago might not have ended completely,